The following program is a Town of Colonie television production of the William K. Sanford Town Library.
It goes all my life's a circle, sunrise and sundown. The moon rolls through the nighttime till the daybreak comes around. And all my life's a circle, I can't tell you why. Seasons spinning round again, the years keep rolling by.
Top of the evening or top of the day, I'm Joe Doolittle, and this is Story by Story.
Sharing the human experience, I'm Kate Dudding.
And we're here to spend an hour sharing a little bit about the art and the lovely nature of storytelling. And Kate and I are both storytellers, and we are joined by a guild of about 50 storytellers around the Capital District. And we'll tell you more about that as we go along. But Kate, you've had a busy summer. You've been out at the National Gathering of Storytellers.
Yes, the National Storytelling Network's conference this year was in Kansas City, which is going to be where our national headquarters is going to be in another year. They're renovating an historic home near a very large library on the outskirts of Kansas City for us.
So the storytellers will have an old home to call the home for storytelling.
Yes. And it was a gathering of about 200 storytellers from across the country, and we had the president of the Canadian Storytellers Association and at least one other member from Canada. And of course, I didn't meet everybody there, so there were probably some other international storytellers there as well.
Right. And so just so that you know, there is a national association. The website is
storynet.org.
And you can find a whole lot about resources for storytelling, local groups, regional groups, and it's a font of information.
But the most exciting thing, well, there were a lot of exciting things, but one of the keynote addresses was by Kendall Haven, who is a storyteller who, with a team of, I think, 49 neuroscientists, studied how story works in the brain. They conducted a series of experiments. The people had like 24 electrodes on their head, and they were monitoring their pulse. And
so there were scientists at this storytelling?
No, well, Kendall Haven was reporting what they had done several years ago, and they found out that story is the way the brain works on the unconscious level. That if you heard these two sentences, Fred died, Sally cried and went hungry, your unconscious brain is putting them together to make sense out of them into a story.
Making a story.
Making a story. And it comes to your consciousness as a story, not as the two separate sentences. My story is Fred was going to the grocery store and had a heart attack and died, and poor Sally was incapacitated at home, and she got hungry, and she cried because she was hungry and because Fred hadn't come home and nobody knew to, I could go on about this story.
So you made this story up while you were listening to the speaker?
Yes. And it's been documented that this is just the way we work. Most of the humans have only been reading for the last 200 years. So reading is at the tail end of the human experience.
Wow.
It's story and has existed as long as people could communicate.
Well, the nature of story as both a gathering of informations and a way of teaching heritage and facts, and the nature of that kind of communication fits really nicely with our guest teller here today, don't you think?
I think so. I think this is a good segue.
I think this is about as good a segue as we're going to get. Our guest teller is Kay Olan, and Kay is with us today, and Kay is a Native American teller. She's a Mohawk, and we're going to find out more about that, but I think it's fair to say that, Kay, you grew up with stories in a way. Is that fair?
Well, not really. When I was a young child, I really started hearing stories as a young adult. As a young adult, and as in my 20s and 30s, that's when I really started getting exposed to Native American stories.
So you grew up on Long Island, but as I remember, your family comes from Aquashoni? I don't say these things.
Good try. My mother grew up on a reservation in upstate New York called Akwesasne. And some people call it St. Regis Mohawk Indian Reservation. And that's where she grew up. Eventually, she wound up in New York City, where she met my dad, who's non-native, and they married and had 2 children. I'm the older, bossier one.
Firstborn.
Firstborn. Yeah. And I spent most of my time on Long Island, but in summertime, we would travel to Akwesasne to visit my mother's family, to visit all my cousins and aunts and uncles and grandparents. And so that was always part of how I saw myself, and I was always very aware of that side of the family.
When did you discover that you were a storyteller?
During those family trips up to Akwesasne in the summertime, sometimes we would take a detour into the Adirondack Mountains, and we would go visit a man called Ray Fadden, Kahana Dolans, and he had a museum in the Adirondacks, and actually I have a memory of that museum being built. He was a science teacher, and when he was teaching, he would teach his native students to be proud of who they were, which was not being done at that time. And he would tell them, if you study hard, finish your studies early enough, I'll tell you stories about your history and about your culture and about the environment. And he taught them to be proud of who they were. And on weekends, he would take them on trips to show them what other people were doing with their lives, to show them the possibilities of what they could do, maybe to help their family, their community, their people. And when he retired from teaching, he built a museum in the Adirondack Mountains in a town called Anchayota. And it's only open in the summertime, not on Mondays. They have a website. It's the Six Nations Indian Museum. And we would stop there and we would visit. My mother knew Ray Fadden, and he knew my mother's family. And it wasn't just for us, but anybody who would stop there would have the opportunity to walk around and look at the exhibits and ask questions. And at some point, Ray would invite people, visitors, to sit down on the benches that were in the museum, and he would tell stories. And I heard those stories right from Ray. And it stuck with me. I was just fascinated by it. But I never, ever, ever thought that I would be a storyteller. I was too shy, and I never thought that I would do that. Well, I became a school teacher, and I taught elementary school for 33 years. And sometime in the 80s, I think it was in the 80s, New York State Department of Education changed the social studies curriculum so that the 4th grade teachers had to teach local history, including about the native peoples of their particular area. But at that time, there weren't very many materials available. Some of the materials were not appropriate for that age. Some of them were not accurate. And so the 4th grade teachers in the building where I was teaching came to me for help. And I brought in whatever I could share with them and try to explain everything to them, and they seemed to be happy with that until one day I brought in a carousel full of slides. This is how long ago it was, before PowerPoint.
Before PowerPoint. You predate PowerPoint?
Yes.
BPP. Ooh.
And I started to explain all of these slides to them, but it was just too much information in too short a period of time for them to be able to absorb all of that. So I said, well, if you'd like, I'll come down to your classrooms during my preparation period and I'll talk to your students. And they said, great. And I guess they liked it because they invited me back every year after that to come and talk to their students. And word got out and people started inviting me to come and speak. And one day, a Girl Scout leader called and she wanted a native storyteller. And I said, well, let me think about who I could recommend to you. And while I was thinking about it, she said, well, do you know stories? And I said, well, I've heard them, but I've never told them. And she said, would you try? So I went and I read stories to these Girl Scouts, and as soon as I did that, I realized that that wasn't right, that I had to go back and relearn them through the oral tradition, listen harder, so that I could retell them that way. And I did that, and people started saying I was a storyteller. But in actuality, I don't think of myself as a storyteller. I never have. I think of myself as an educator, as a teacher who gets her foot in the door by telling stories so that I can teach people about who we really are.
She is a guerrilla storyteller. We have a term for that. Kate does that in art museums, so that and we'll come back to that, but we know exactly what you mean by that.
Yeah.
Now, one of the things that would be, I know we've got a lot we want to cover, but could you tell us one of your Mohawk stories, and maybe then we could talk a little bit about that, and then we could continue to talk, because you're just a fountain of material, kind of like talking about the National Storytelling.
Well, thank you. This is the hard part, is trying to figure out which story to tell. There's so many stories that I love, and this is my story bag, and I have it filled with items that remind me of the stories that I've learned. And so I pulled out this object, this little bird, thinking that you might ask me to tell a story. And I pulled this out because it's one of the stories that might have been forgotten if Ray Fadden hadn't taught us all this story. And it's one of the first stories I learned, so I really enjoy it. In this story, it talks about how long, long ago, the birds had no songs. And it came to be that one day, the Creator, the one that made us all, came down to Mother Earth to see how things were going. And he walked past a grove of trees, and just then the wind picked up, and it made the leaves rustle in the treetops. And he listened, and he thought, oh, that's wonderful. The trees have a song, and it's a beautiful song. And then he walked past a stream, and as he stopped to listen, he noticed that the water was running over the rocks and pebbles in the stream, and it made a gurgling sound. And he listened, and he thought, oh, that's wonderful too. The water has a song, and it's beautiful. And then he walked past a village of the Umwe, of the two-leggeds, of the human beings. And just then, a man came out of the longhouse to sing a song to greet the new day. And he said, that's good. Even the people have songs. Then he walked past a bush, and in that bush there was a little bird, just like this. And he stopped to listen, but in those days the birds had no songs. And so he listened, and he heard nothing. And that's when he got an idea, and he spoke to that bird. He said, I would like you to deliver a message for me. I would like you to fly to the north, to the south, to the east, to the west, and gather all of the bird people, have them all come here and meet here, because I have something important to tell them. And that little bird was so excited, he flew right away. He flew in every direction. He called all of the bird people to that meeting. And when they were all gathered together, the Creator said, you know, the trees have a song, and the water has a song, and even the people have songs. I think the birds should have songs too. Now, I could just give you this gift. I could just give you all a song. But it's come to my attention that sometimes when you give people or you give beings a gift and they don't have to work for it, sometimes they don't appreciate it as much. So I want you to treasure this gift. I want you to love this gift, appreciate it. So you're going to have to work very hard to get it. Tomorrow morning, when the sun's rays appear over the horizon, all of you will fly as high as you can up into the sky. And when you can fly no higher, that's when you will hear your song. But just to make sure you work your hardest, let me tell you this. The one who flies the highest will get the most beautiful song of all. Well, all of the birds were very excited, except for the little thrush. The little thrush happened to be sitting next to a great big eagle, and he noticed that eagle was big and strong and powerful looking, and he thought to himself, well, I don't have a chance. Eagle obviously will get the most beautiful song of all. He'll fly the highest, and I won't get that song. And so instead of being happy about getting a song, he was sad because it might not be the most beautiful. Well, it was hard for all of the birds to sleep that night. They were so excited. And the next morning, they were wide awake, waiting for the dawn. And that little thrush found himself sitting next to Great Big Eagle again. And he noticed that Eagle was just as excited as all of the other birds. And that's when he got an idea. He thought, I bet I could fly behind Eagle and hide in his neck feathers. And I bet Eagle won't even notice. He's just too excited. And so that's what he did. He flew behind Eagle and hid in Eagle's neck feathers. And he was right. Eagle didn't notice. He was just too excited. And that's little thrush went to sleep back there. Well, the sun's rays appeared over the horizon. All of the birds spread out their wings. They all flew up into the sky, higher and higher, and they flew as high as they could. And when they couldn't fly any higher, they drifted back down to Mother Earth, and they heard their songs. The first one to get tired was the hummingbird, the smallest bird of all, heard his song. And then the sparrows and the chickadees and the wrens heard their songs. And then the robins and the blue jays. Until finally only the largest birds were left in the sky. The hawks, the eagle, the vulture. But eventually, Eagle looked around and he saw that there was no one left in the sky. All of the other birds had tired. And he thought to himself, I guess I'm going to get the most beautiful song. And when he couldn't move his wings one more time, he changed direction. And he started to drift back down to Mother Earth. But when he changed direction, that little thrush who'd been asleep back here all that time woke up. He felt that change. And he flew out from behind Eagle's neck feathers. And he flew up into the sky. And when he did that, Eagle noticed, but he was too tired to do anything about it. All he could do was look up and glare at that little thrush. Even today, that's how Eagle looks. He still looks upset. He still looks angry because that little thrush tricked him. Well, that thrush flew higher and higher until he saw a hole in the sky. He flew up through that hole in the sky, and there he saw a beautiful place covered with green grass and tall trees, and there were rivers that ran crystal clear the way our rivers used to be before we polluted them. And then he heard it. He heard the most beautiful song of all, and he memorized it. And he flew down through the hole in the sky, down, down, down to the council rock where all of the bird people were waiting. And when he looked down, he saw all of the birds looking up at him, and they all looked upset. And that was when that little thrush realized that he had done something wrong. That was the first time he felt embarrassed and ashamed. He realized he had tricked his friend the eagle out of getting the most beautiful song. He was so ashamed that he hid in the thickest brush where nobody could see him. And he's still there. We call him Hermit Thrush. You hardly ever get to see him. But every now and then he has to sing his song. And when he does, all of the other birds, they stop to listen because they say that it's the most beautiful song of all. And that's how the birds got their songs. But that also reminds us that we can't feel good about what we have unless we know that we worked hard to get it without hurting somebody else, without tricking our friends. And that's how that story goes.
Wonderful. Just wonderful.
Now, I was told that traditionally, after the telling of a story, people would then have the opportunity to talk about it, to discuss it, to figure out if there was maybe a way in which they could apply it to their lives or if there was a lesson to be learned. And so, in many cases, this was a way in which values could be transferred from one generation to another. And it was also a way to explain why things are the way they are.
Just masterful. Just masterful.
Having that little furry
bird call
toy actually sing was quite surprising.
And was that one of Ray's stories that you heard first on vacation, did you say?
Actually, I heard it from one of his students. I heard it from his student. I did hear, well, when Ray passed away, the museum came under the directorship of his son, John, and his grandchildren. And so I've heard stories from all of them. There's 4 generations of Fadden storytellers. And so they all have taken on that responsibility of keeping the stories alive, to keep them going, and teaching all of us those stories. And so now, you know, it's a legacy that Ray gave to us, because I really feel as though maybe that story would have been forgotten if it weren't for him.
And he certainly hasn't been forgotten either.
No, it's amazing how many times I speak to groups and I'll mention his name and I'll see somebody's eyes get big and light up because they've been to his museum, or maybe they were one of his students.
Or I never knew him, but our friend Fran Yardley tells a non-native story about Ray Fadden and the porcupine.
The porcupine.
The porcupine.
The porcupine.
That they took into their home. Yes.
That was actually a story. That's a story of needles, and I
Needles, yes, of course.
I told that story at a teacher workshop, and 2 years later, one of those teachers came to me and said she used it in her classroom because she had a student come into the room, and he was obviously having a bad day. He couldn't function. He wouldn't speak to anybody. He just, something was really bothering him, and she couldn't figure out what it was. So eventually, after she tried everything in her teacher's bag of tricks and nothing worked, she gave her students an assignment, and she sat down next to him and told him the story of needles. And at the very end, he just started laughing, and he put down, he picked up his pencil and he went to work, and he was able to function again. And I'm sure it had nothing to do with his problem, but that story helped him put his problem aside for a little while so he could deal with it later and then carry on with his life.
A bit of respite.
Yes.
Sometimes stories that's the best you can do. A friend of mine has told stories at veterans hospitals, and to the recently wounded coming back from the Middle East. And she said, I want to give them a respite. I want to have them laugh.
Yeah.
and with their family there, make it a good experience.
And that's medicine.
It's medicine.
It's medicine.
Oh,
So
yeah.
stories can be medicine. Stories can open the door to discussion. They can help us deal with our problems or forget about them for a little while. Yeah, or maybe help us make connections with each other.
Yeah, once I was under a great deal of stress at my day job, not as a storyteller, but as my day job, and I became clinically depressed. And I went and got some medication, and because they felt my brain chemistry had been knocked out of alignment, and the medicine I was taking would help get that production back up. And my counselor said, when she found I was also a storyteller, she said, "Do you think you could find a story that would have any relevance to this?" I went, but when you're clinically depressed, your thought processes are greatly affected. So I said, I bet I could. And in 2 weeks, I came back with a story of what I had been doing and a story of what I should have been doing. And I thank her very much for asking that question.
You treated yourself.
Yes, yes, that I hadn't protected my heart, that I had let the things that were happening at work go much too deeply. And so yes, stories, I mean, those were ancient stories, and they have so much wisdom because they only exist now because people have consistently told them generation after generation over hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. So those old stories are real important.
We have so many different kinds of stories, too. We have stories about our history. We have stories that are lesson stories, like Aesop's fables, so that we can pass on our values. We have stories that explain why the world is the way it is. We have stories that are sad, happy, scary, so that we can express all of our emotions and figure out how to deal with them. And we have personal stories. Too. We have old stories and new stories, too.
I want you to hold those stories for just a couple of minutes because we're going to talk about some things that are going on in the storytelling community that we want you to know about as our listeners. And then we'll come back to Kay and we'll reflect again on some of the stories coming out of Native Americans in our part of the world, right here in upstate New York. Kay, what do we got going?
Oh my goodness, what don't we have going? September is full of storytelling. I'd like to mention the last two parts of the Not Just for Kids storytelling series at Schoharie Crossing, just west of Amsterdam. In case this gets shown a little early, August 30th, 4 stories high will be telling. It's actually 3 stories high because Carol Conley is in the process of moving to North Carolina. So Margaret French is taking her story. 4 stories high, I think of it as a building. So
So we have a substitute story, is that what we got?
Well, or a substitute storyteller.
Okay.
And then on skipping over Labor Day, Jackson Gilman from Massachusetts, formerly of Maine, will be telling the magic of Rudyard Kipling's Just So stories. And he dresses as Rudyard Kipling. It's
don't
really
want to miss
amazing.
that. It's
no, you
really
don't want to
great.
miss that.
He's really great.
September 13th. And then the first Tuesday of the month.
We're opening our season at Arthur's with First Tuesdays, and it's going to be September stories, and the invited guest is Elizabeth Rowe, and we're going to have a good time of kind of sharing stories of getting ready for change.
Oh.
And maybe new colors.
Yeah, because September always has that feeling of, I guess from the school year, it's starting,
And if you want to meet Kay Olan in person, she'll be joining us at Arthur's on October 6th at 7 o'clock, and we have a about a 2-hour run, and you'll get a chance to see and listen to Kay on the 6th of October. So there you go.
There we go. Then up in Saratoga, that storytelling open mic series resumes again on September 9th. It's the second Wednesday of the month. They alternate between Cafe Lena and Woodlawn Commons, which is a part of the Wesley community. And there will be a featured teller, but I don't know who it is yet. But Kay, you've been a featured teller for that, and I think each of us has. So
it's fun time.
Then on the second Friday of the month, the Shawnicky evenings at the Irish American Heritage Museum will be starting up. Oh my goodness, it's me and Anne-Marie McLaughlin.
We have some wonderful storytellers on that Friday night. We have Kate and Anne-Marie McLaughlin, and it's going to be just a super time and a great place to come and listen to stories in downtown Albany.
I'm mostly Celtic in my heritage. Anne-Marie was born in County Donegal. She is 100%. Then, that same weekend, on Saturday and Sunday, September 12th and 13th, up at Saratoga Spa State Park near the Victoria Pool, will be the Saratoga Native American Festival. And new this year is the admission is free, which is extraordinary.
And free parking.
And free parking.
And Kay Olan is on the board of directors of Undakina, which is the main sponsor of that effort. And we know the folks there because it's Joe Bruchek and his sons, Jesse and Jamie. Yep.
Then we're starting up our series that same weekend over in Salem. We're starting up our second season in Salem for word plays at their cabaret. The topic is The Road Not Taken. And 4 storytellers, Siri Allison, Betty Cassidy, Margaret French, and Nancy Marie Payne, will be telling stories about the roads not taken.
That's a lot of events.
We're not done yet. We're just up to the 15th.
It's exciting.
Where we have our normal story circle meeting. And Joe is the father of most of these events.
I don't know. You've helped birth them too, kid.
Well, not as many, but yes. I came up with the idea of the open mic up in Saratoga, and then put out to our guild, and who would like to run this? And Margaret French and Janine Laverty and Christy Keegan raised their hands, bless their hearts. So our next guild meeting is on Tuesday, September 15th, right here at the Colonie Town Library, 6:30 to 8:30, to share stories under development. We ask you that you tell, not read. As Kay mentioned, reading is different than telling. When you're telling, you can always look at people's faces. And when they go, you go, oh, I just said something they don't understand. Let's see, I need to put something in here to clarify that. Or when they're going like this, you go, you know what I mean. Yeah.
And we encourage folks who are interested in learning more about storytelling to show up at a guild meeting or any of these events. But the Story Circle meeting here at the library is a pretty informal time, and it gets you a chance to maybe tell a story yourself and listen to tellers talk about how they're putting things together. So come on over.
Right. And the teller is in charge of if they get any feedback at all. Most tellers are willing to accept the first step, which is appreciations. And then that often, if it's the first time you're telling the story, that's all you want. That you've gotten it out and you can think back on your mind what worked and what didn't work. It's only when you're working on it later that you've kind of finished. It's mostly polished, that you're ready to hear if people are having problems with a section or have any suggestions. But you can just ask for the problems. You don't have to ask for the suggestions. It's all up to the teller. So it's we like to create a safe environment for working on your stories. Then Janet Carter down in Saugerties has her storytelling series at the Inquiring Minds bookstore on the third Friday of the month, which in September is the 18th. Then we open our 9th season at Proctor's with word plays. Again, same topic as at Salem, The Road Not Taken. We have some of the same storytellers, some different storytellers. So you'll be hearing some new stories if you want to go to both. Fran Berger, Betty Cassidy, Joe and I, and Margaret French will be at Proctor's on Sunday the 20th. And we will be in the GE Theater, which we normally aren't for word plays, but Proctor's had a customer who wanted all the little smaller rooms. And so there's another activity in the Fenimore Art Gallery where we normally are for word plays. And then now we're in October, and then we'll get to some events Kay brought to us. October 4th is our 115th Story Sunday at the Glenn Sanders Mansion. It's our 17th season.
Something like that.
Yes. And we'll start out with a benefit for the Animal Protective Foundation in Glenville for the love of animals. Christy Keegan has been a volunteer, a rescuer, a docent, a storyteller at various animal-oriented foundations on the East Coast and in the Southwest.
Right.
She says vultures are really quite adorable once you get to know them, for instance.
For instance.
For instance. So she's going to share some of her stories. Her love of animals started when she was 4. And her mother's cat did not like her. And her father brought home a stray ginger cat. The first love of her life from the animal world.
And then she's got the story about how she kidnapped her first dog, too. I remember that one.
Well,
Stay
yes.
tuned for that.
And Bufada dog.
A lot
yes.
of stories there,
Oh.
and it'll be great, and it'll also benefit a very worthwhile agency in the community.
Yes. So we invite you all to come to all of these events. Now, Kay, you brought us. Let's see. We mentioned about the Native American storytelling at Saratoga, but you also brought us. In Fonda. You'll please say it.
These are events taking place at Kanachohalege. Kanachohalege is the real way to say Kanajahari. So this is a traditional Mohawk community located 7 miles west of Fonda, New York, on State Highway 5. And you can learn more about the community by looking at www.mohawkcommunity.com. And they have some events coming up. One is a traditional hand drum making workshop. Anybody can come, but you need to register in advance. And that will be taught on October 10th. And you get to take your own hand drum home with you. And it includes a light breakfast and a light lunch and materials and instruction. And it's just a wonderful experience taught by a wonderful Mohawk teacher, Jackie Labanti. And it's October 10th from 9 to 6. And to register, you call, can I give a phone number? Is that okay?
Yes, you can.
Yeah.
And I'll make up a slide on this that Greg will put up. But
Great.
do say
Great.
it, and we'll be seeing it when.
So the phone number is 518-584-9270, and we ask people to register ahead of time if they want to come to that class. It's back by popular demand. It's just a wonderful class. Some people have taken the class and have come back other times to make another drum. Mm-hmm. Then there's going to be a traditional teachings series also held at Kanachohalege. And it's going to be taught by Tom Porter, Zagogwenungwas, who is a Mohawk elder and spiritual leader. He's also the person who has opened every Saratoga Native Festival since its beginning. He's done the opening address there and the closing address there, the traditional address every year. He will be speaking on September 19th from 10 to 4 about the Haudenosaunee creation story, the creation story of what many people call the Iroquois people, the Iroquois Confederacy. And that includes lunch. It's $25. And again, you call that same phone number to register in advance. Then on October 3rd, he'll be talking about the Haudenosaunee and Haudenosaunee clan system, the clan system of the Iroquois Confederacy. On October 17th, he'll be talking about the 4 sacred rituals of the Haudenosaunee. October 24th, he'll be talking about the Great Law. That's the Constitution of the Iroquois Confederacy. And then on November 14th, he'll be talking about the Galiwio, the Code of Handsome Lake. And this is something that a lot of people just don't know anything about. And Tom is an incredible speaker and storyteller who has this great knowledge of tradition and history, but he's also one of those few people who can express it in a way that makes sense to people and touches them, and he knows how to make people laugh and cry, and he knows how to express all of this knowledge in a way that's understandable, in a way in which people can possibly apply it to their own lives. It's just, he's mesmerizing.
And Tom, while we're kind of on this topic, Kay, Tom was actually the driver for establishing, and I won't say it correctly, Kaneshokaleke?
You're getting better and better.
Well, I'm working on my Mohawk.
Yes. Kanajohalege. He is the founder and the spiritual leader at Kanajohalege, yes.
And that brought the Mohawks back to their valley because of their decision on siding with the English during the Revolution. They weren't allowed back in the valley after the Revolutionary War. So you've finally come home, and that's actually also the fulfillment of a prophecy from the time that you left the valley, the Mohawk left the valley. So that this place in the valley is very important and sacred for your people, right?
It is. It's actually located on the site of old Mohawk Bear Clan village sites. Archaeologically, layer upon layer upon layer, many, many villages were located there. And as you mentioned, yes, there was a prophecy that someday we would return. And Tom is one of the people that made that happen in 1993. And the name Kanajohalege is the original name for that area.
Okay.
The original name for that area. So it's just, anybody can attend these events, but we do ask the people register in advance. So that way we can figure out how many people we need to feed and what kinds of foods to have available.
Kay, you've got some of the replicas of the historic wampum belts, and maybe you could just tell us a little bit about the 2 belts. And I'm a little bit familiar with both of them because of my reading, and I helped host folks on the 2-row paddle. But they're very important, and as stories, they are stories of themselves. And explain the numismatic value of the kind of.
Yeah. Wampum are cylindrically shaped beads that are either purple or white that are made from the whelk shell or the quahog or quahog shell. This is a kind of an asymmetrical, thick clam shell, and you can see the colors inside. And those beads can be strung together to be used in ceremonies, and we still do use them in ceremonies, or to help send messages, or they can be woven together in what people call belts. And these are belts, and there are many, many different kinds that are red. This is a record of our history and important events and treaties. And what we would do is notice which of our people had good memories, and we would train them to memorize the speeches that would go with each belt and ask them to recite those from time to time. Some people call this the Hiawatha Belt. Has nothing to do with Longfellow's Hiawatha. Some people call this the Confederacy Belt. And this one is a replica of a 2,000-year-old belt. And if I were to tell you this whole story, it would take about 4 to 10 days to tell you the whole story. But just briefly, just to summarize a bit, if you look at it this way, going from east to west, it talks about how 2,000 years ago, the peacemaker came to us with a message of peace and unity, and he helped to unify the Ganyangahaga, or the Mohawk Nation, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, and the Seneca nations into a peace confederacy, into a United Nations based on trying to settle our differences by talking instead of by fighting. And you'll notice that these nations are connected by a white road of peace that extends to the east and west as an invitation to other nations to also, if they're looking for that kind of peace and harmony, to symbolically follow that road back to the great tree of peace, where they can find protection and sanctuary if they agree to settle their differences in a logical way rather than in a warring way. So that's just a tiny, tiny part of that story.
And actually, in the history of the Haudenosaunee, a tribe did join as the 6th tribe. The Tuscarora came on into the Confederacy in
the 1700s,
right.
Yes. So when you hear the terms 5 nations, which it's referring to these 5 nations, when you hear 6 nations, it's referring to these 5 nations plus the Tuscarora, who came up from the Carolinas in the 1700s. When you hear Iroquois Confederacy, when you hear Haudenosaunee or Haudenosaunee, they're all different names for the same thing, for this peace confederacy. The Mohawk and the Oneida call this the Haudenosaunee. The Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca call it the Haudenosaunee, which means the people of the longhouse. We used to live in long, bark-covered houses. But again, that's just a little bit about this story. This is a replica of a 400-year-old treaty, a 400-year-old belt that reminds us of a treaty that was made more than 400 years ago. And this is called the Gaswenta, or the 2-row, because it has 2 purple rows here. And some people call this the grandfather of all treaties. And this was an agreement that was made between the Dutch and our people more than 400 years ago, because what happened was our people noticed that the Dutch were coming into our territories, and they were building houses and making gardens and bringing their families. And so our people had a meeting and said, well, it looks like they're going to stay for a while. You know, we need to talk about how we're going to live side by side, again, in peace and in harmony. How are we going to do this? And so it was agreed to make this belt. And this belt, the white beads, represent a river of life, because we all travel down a river of life, all of us. And on this river of life, there are 2 vessels. One is a ship and one is a canoe. And the ship belongs to the Europeans. And everything that makes them who they are, that defines who they are, is symbolically in that ship. Their people, their language, their songs, their dances, their history, their clothing, their food is in that ship. And the same thing with the canoe. Everything that defines who we are is in that canoe. Our people, our ceremonies, our stories, our language, everything is in that canoe. And the agreement that was made was that as we travel down this river of life, that we would not interfere in each other's ways, but rather, if you notice, the 2 rows are parallel. We would not climb into their ship and try to steer their ship, and they would not try to steer our canoe. That we would live as brothers, side by side as brothers, not as father and son, one above the other, but as brothers in mutual respect, forever as we travel on this river of life. And there's 3 beads here representing peace, friendship, forever. And there was also the acknowledgement that we, traveling as brothers on the river of life, would all agree to take care of the water, because water is life, and we can't exist without it. No matter if you're in the ship or in the canoe, we all need that water for the plants to grow and for the animals to live and for the human beings to live. And so we all are supposed to share that responsibility of taking care of the water and everything in the environment. And this is supposed to stay in effect as long as the grass shall grow, as long as the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, and as long as the rivers flow. And this morning I saw the sun rise in the east. The grass, after we got this little bit of rain today, is greening again, and the rivers, they're still flowing. So we are working very hard to try to remind people about this agreement.
Kind of bring the story to current times, because just a couple years ago, to bring some visibility to the issues expressed in the Belt, a number of members of the Haudenosaunee, and I think they were led by the Onondagas, as I remember, because they started in Syracuse, and they paddled the whole length of the Mohawk and the whole length of the Hudson, and they presented the story of the Belt at the United Nations, as I remember the story. And to bring really this issue of remembrance of things promised to the environment, really to shed light on it at the international level. And that story was carried by a fair number of people. I want to say 40
and it wasn't,
or 50.
Yeah, it wasn't just Haudenosaunee people. It was Native people from as far away as Alaska, and they traveled in one row down the Mohawk and down the Hudson. And then there were non-Native people, the allies, that traveled in the other row, side by side, all that way. It started out at Syracuse, and there was this big celebration, the Capital District area, and then they headed down, as you mentioned, down the Hudson River to New York City. There was a march to the UN where they were all invited inside to come and speak. And what they did was ask the leaders of the world to find ways in which to honor all indigenous treaties all over the world. Find ways to honor those treaties and find ways to protect the water for everybody in the world. And yes, that just happened a couple of years ago. And in acknowledgement of the 400th anniversary, 400th birthday of the Goswenta. And there are still people who are continuing the tradition, talking to people wherever we have the opportunity to educate people about this, that we all have to share in this responsibility of finding ways to live in harmony and respect and acknowledge our relationship to the natural world and our dependency on clean water and clean air and Mother Earth. So it was a great example, a living, breathing example of how this could work, because they had to work and paddle together for an extended period of time to make this happen. And it was hundreds of people that were involved by the time they got to New York City.
That was wonderful.
You can watch excerpts, by the way, if you Google Two-Row Wampum Renewal Campaign. You can watch online.
How much time do we have?
We have 4.5 minutes. Okay, that was Two-Row Wampum
Renewal Campaign.
And I will look that up, and we will have that on the screen.
Thank you.
as part of this story.
Kate, this may not be fair. I've been unfair earlier, but I've been admiring your silver. And can you tell us a little story about your silver clasp and maybe Uncle Julius?
Yes, my Uncle Julius was a high steel worker. A lot of high steel worker. He worked on bridges and skyscrapers. A lot of Mohawk men did that. He worked all over. He worked on the Unisphere. He worked on the World Trade Center, and he had a lot of energy, he had a lot of questions, and he had a lot of creativity. And so at one point he started carving leather and making beautiful, beautiful objects out of leather. And then that led to an interest in working with silver. And at first he would make silver pieces that copied Southwestern designs, but then he came to the realization that we have our own symbols here in the Northeast, and so he started making pieces that tell our story. So this is a storytelling piece, and this includes our creation story and the formation of the Confederacy. So there's probably a month's worth of stories in this piece. Here's the Great Tree of Peace as part of the story of the formation of the Confederacy. Here are all of our clan symbols belonging to the Haudenosaunee. Here are all of our condoled chiefs holding hands. And here are the celestial sky domes. And then over here are the twin brothers who are part of the creation story and the symbols that go with them. And one of these days, when you have, anywhere between 20 minutes to 4 days, I can share the story with you about this.
Oh, there's no shortcut to a Native American story, is there? Thank you for that. I've been admiring it ever since I first met you in the parking lot. It just dazzles. And actually, don't you think Kay kind of dazzles?
Oh yes, yes. With a light that's pure and illuminating, not a flashy at all, but steady and pure.
How
and I can only
nice,
say
thank
that,
you.
And I can only say, to add to that, I wish my kids had you as a teacher, because that must have been really special.
Oh,
yeah.
Yes. Or even in her school where she was a guest visitor.
Right. And we thank you for coming, and remember that website for the Mohawk Community.com, because that'll give you a lot more information and what's going on out at Ganachakalehe. And don't miss out on that, because that is a continuing resource for learning and for really some entertaining programs.
Yes.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Oh, the hour went so quickly, and it's time, unfortunately, for us to sign off.
And we can only say thank you, and we hope to see you next month, and we hope to see you around our storytelling circle. Much good cheer.
It goes all my life's a circle, sunrise and sundown. The moon rolls through the nighttime till the daybreak comes around. And all my life's a circle, but I can't tell you why. Seasons spin